Hi, Internet, and welcome to episode 3 of Open Paren. I am here with Miriam Posner, who is the Digital Humanities Program Coordinator at UCLA and is also on the Executive Council of Computing and the Humanities. So we get to talk about all kinds of digital humanities stuff today, because I'm not just going to talk to librarians, I'm going to talk to people who are near libraries doing super relevant things. Which I'll get to in a moment. But first, I want to ask you the question that they ask at the beginning of my new favorite podcast, Another Round, which is, what do you do and why?
Oh, what do I do? So I work at UCLA, obviously, as you said, and I think like the main way I would describe my job is that I teach. So I teach in our undergraduate, minor, and graduate certificate. And then the other big part of my job is keeping the trains running on time for our program. Just making sure that we're able to offer the right classes at the right time. And, we have probably about 70 minors and another couple dozen grad students now. So I spend a lot of time just advising them and trying to assemble resources for them at UCLA.
Yeah, I saw on the website that you have something like 35 faculty members, which is kind of epic size for a digital humanities program. And I was wondering, how did UCLA get to have this large of a program?
I think it was really an organic process that started a long time before I got here. DH, I think, happens in different ways at different institutions. And at UCLA, it's been primarily faculty driven, which has a lot of implications for like administrative structure and stuff like that. But I think that as faculty got interested in it and built projects and recruited other faculty who work in similar areas over time, and this has been 20 years, the expertise has accrued.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I noticed talking to digital humanities people is that if you ask 10 of them what digital humanities is, you get at least 15 answers, possibly mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming with that interdisciplinary of a faculty, you have a lot of potential answers to the question of what is digital humanities. So I'm curious as to your answer.
Yeah, well, my answer is actually super simple. I like to say that it's the use of digital tools to explore humanities questions. And so I think that leaves a lot of latitude for an individual researcher to decide, what the most meaningful way to do that is. But I do emphasize explore humanities questions and not answer, because something that I think is fundamental to the humanities is this notion that there is no concrete and unequivocal answer to any given question. That's just not the point of what we do. So in my mind, that simple definition emphasizes that we're not assembling data to come to an undisputable conclusion the way one might do in a different field, but we are assembling data and running analyses on it to sort of suggest new interpretations.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe some of the interesting explorations that are going on in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, there's a ton of stuff. In fact, a big, challenge in my job is just keeping track of it, because people are just so active. But I just sat in on a presentation from Tim Tingerlini, who's in our Scandinavian section here at UCLA, and also interestingly in Korean language. So those are his two languages that he works on. He works with Pete Broadwell, who is a programmer based in the library here at UCLA. And Tim's specialty is folklore, particularly Scandinavian folklore. And so he and Pete have developed something that they call Elf Yelp, that allows you to associate or allows the researchers to associate locations with particular folk tales from Scandinavian history, using this kind of location-specific topic modeling process. So you can actually trace the elves to their particular locations in the countryside, which is kind of cool. It's a companion to Witch Hunter, which is their other exploration of folktales with computational methods.
So are these real world locations, or some of them not, or both?
These are real world locations. So as I understand it, this technique, which is called latent geographical topic analysis, LGTA, looks for kind of symptoms of locations within texts, and then refines those locations so that it can actually map them specifically. Yeah, it's kind of cool. It's online, and I'll send you the link.
Excellent, because I would love to have that link available.
It's really cool. Yeah,
to look at.
It has a complicated URL, but it's really cool.
It will not be complicated to click on, so that's the important part.
That's right. Yeah. So that's one thing. There's also a lot of activity here around historical reconstruction of 3D objects and buildings. We have a lot of digital archaeologists here who have assembled quite a lot of data about historical structures, and so it's been sort of a natural extension of that work to try to recreate those structures in 3D space, and then experiment with things like if a procession was taking place in the ancient Roman Forum, how much space would the people actually have to navigate between buildings, things like that are usefully answered with 3D models.
I find myself kind of reminded of the New York Public Library's mapping stuff with their historical maps and their space-time.
Yeah, they do great work at NYPL for sure. Yeah, and I mean, I think, in both cases, there's a tension between what the data can tell us and what we want to know about the past. And so part of any kind of digital humanities methodology is developing some kind of vocabulary to describe that gap between what we know and what we can and what we want to know. So a lot of people interested in 3D modeling at UCLA have been interested in modeling absence or ambiguity in historical models, for example.
Yeah, so that's something I'm really curious about, because I find myself thinking a lot about the limitations in metadata from a diversity perspective, right? Because I think you touched on this some in a blog post you wrote on the unrealized potential of the digital humanities, where you're talking about how our vocabulary for describing time or race may not actually match the descriptions that participants would use to describe their own experiences of time or their own race or what have you. But when you're doing a computational system, you have to have something that's specific enough that you can taxonomize or build linked data around it or something. And so I found myself really interested in how do you locate these limitations in your metadata, and what can you do to fill them in or get around them, or at least be honest about what you've got going on. So I'm curious what sort of techniques you found yourself or people in your unit using to deal with ways that metadata is not only limited, but is limited in ways that make it maybe not tell the story that the participants would have understood.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think it is kind of like it's an active question. I don't think it's a question that anyone really has an answer to. But one thing that I've been doing with my students is practicing describing what the data actually tells us, versus what it's tempting to say that it tells us. So, just to take one example, we're working right now with a set of data about shipwrecks off the coast of New Jersey. It's a really cool data set, and the students are having a lot of fun with it. But one thing we have to keep reminding ourselves is that this is not a representation of the shipwrecks themselves, which could have been interpreted and experienced in a lot of different ways. It's a data set representing, those shipwrecks that were recorded and published, and whose accounts were published in the newspaper, and whom someone was able to locate and then distill into structured data. And that structured data, we've been practicing reminding ourselves, is always gathered with a particular purpose in mind. And that purpose may not to express the experience of the people, for example, who were caught in the shipwrecks, but to understand maybe its geographic components. So just reminding yourself, what the data actually can tell you about and what the data can't tell you about is a really important exercise, just as a first step. And then, we've been doing a lot of reading about, ontologies and the ideological implications of any particular ontology when it comes to data. And I think that kind of work is really important and useful in just understanding the implications of any decision to divide a phenomenon into structured data. The more practice you get at it, at kind of critiquing a data structure, the better able you are to perform a sophisticated critique and then work with it in more sophisticated ways.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything in particular you'd recommend reading along those lines? Because I'm sure that librarians will be all about critical ontology.
For sure. Yeah, actually, it was, there was a recent issue of, I think it's the Journal of Cataloging and Classification, on indigenous ontologies. And I found that entire issue just like really generative and thought-provoking. There is one particular article just on thinking through the history of attempts to formalize indigenous knowledge structures. And I think the authors' names are Duarte and Velarde Lewis within that journal issue. That I think just clarified a whole range of questions for me and raised other ones.
Mm-hmm. I will look that up.
Yeah, it's a great
issue.
Then
so I'm also wondering, like, once you have these sort of big picture theoretical critiques, how do you find that impacting the actual code that people write or the interfaces that people build? How do you represent this to people who weren't inside of that conversation?
Yeah, well, I think it's a problem that we're still working on and that we haven't satisfactorily addressed yet. But I think that I'm seeing more and more interest in efforts to represent those kinds of tensions and conflicts and paradoxes. I mean, there's some really smart people working in data visualization and interface design who have noticed the same things we have in terms of gaps between what the data can tell us and what we want it to tell us. And so I'm seeing a lot more interest in visualization that encodes affect, for example, or visualizations that change depending on whose perspective you're looking at them from. There's a lot of attention being paid to visualizing ambiguity. No one's figured it out yet, but it's something that there's a lot of attention being paid to. so I think that there is a critical mass kind of forming around these questions, but none of them have been really satisfactorily addressed yet. Um, Having said that, yeah, so I think that one thing that we should acknowledge about a visualization that accomplishes this kind of work is that it may not feel satisfactory to people who look at it. Like, in
How
fact,
so?
it probably won't, because the current um, repertoire of conventions for data visualization is to make data perform useful work and to be immediately legible. And part of what a lot of us have been trying to do is to kind of trouble that purported relationship between data and pure knowledge. So if a visualization actually accomplishes that, then it's probably going to be unsatisfying to a lot of people.
Do you have some example projects that people could look at to feel what that's like?
Yeah, I mean, I think the journal Vectors is probably a good, I think maybe it's a path not taken. That's kind of how I've been thinking about it lately within digital humanities. If you've spent any time looking at Vectors, which was a journal out of USC, it it produced, I don't quite know how many issues, maybe 10 issues, that um, that that work with scholarly material in interesting and innovative ways. And a lot of times my students will tell me that these pieces feel unsatisfying to them, or poorly executed, because they can't navigate them with the immediacy and ease that they expect. But I think that that's intentional, that there's an insistence that the interface is part of the argument within vectors. But it's just that we don't have a vocabulary yet for working with that kind of material.
Mm-hmm. So to take a right angle, you mentioned before a project that someone was working on with a programmer in the library, and I am interested in hearing more about how librarians are supporting digital humanities, or how you think they should or can support digital humanities.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about it, and I know a lot of people have too. So my sense of the situation right now for librarians, and I'm sure librarians will correct me if I'm wrong about this, is that librarians are overworked and overburdened, just kind of in general. A subject librarian is covering like 5 subjects, and that's at UCLA, which is a big school. I imagine they're covering many more at smaller schools. And they're being asked to report metrics in a very rigorous way. And the incursion of the digital hasn't really lightened people's burden particularly. And meanwhile, what's also happening is that university librarians are saddling them with the additional workload of digital humanities. I mean, that seems to be, from my kind of amateurish observations, that seems to be what's mostly being the case. And given librarians' already heavy workload, the addition of this whole new subject domain is, I think, as likely to provoke exhaustion as excitement. Which is not to say that there aren't a lot of librarians who are excited about it. It's just that relies on a lot of goodwill and extra time from librarians, rather than, rewards for their labor, which is what produces good work. So that's my first kind of observation about it. And the second is that librarians are not being they're not being allocated the resources they need in order to work on or even provide meaningful assistance with digital humanities projects. Just the way that resources and labor are apportioned in the typical university library means that no individual librarian is able to marshal all the resources that he or she needs to make a project happen, except in the best cases. So, so all of that, I think, produces some exhaustion in, our best people, and then also I think some skepticism about, the relationship between librarians and digital humanities at large.
Yeah, I suspect you will not find a lot of argument with the statement that most librarians do not have the resources and the support that they wish they did have. And I keep finding that in terms of the resources, digital humanities tends to be very complicated because it exists at this very interdisciplinary place, and also at this place where the recognition structures for that kind of work don't necessarily exist, right? So if you're spending all of your time putting together a digital thing as opposed to a peer-reviewed paper, it may be no less sophisticated, but like, where do you get tenure from it or what have you? And that makes life hard.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's quite, like, to use a disgusting turn of phrase, it's very high touch.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that it just, anyone who's collaborating on a digital project has to be like super in the weeds, and that can be really hard to justify if you have a boss who's looking for you to account for your time in a very detailed way. So it's a problem for librarians, but also for like everyone. Honestly, these are questions that no one's worked out about labor in digital humanities.
I was doing a project for a client this morning, and I think I'm up to my first milestone and can invoice for it. And I discovered, like, to my absolute shock, the actual amount of time I've spent is pretty close to the amount of time that I estimated, and therefore the amount of money I bid, because that never happens, like, as you know.
Yeah, totally.
Which I can do only because I've been doing this enough that I keep records, and I have invoiced enough people hourly that I can do some estimates. But it was shocking because, as you know, like, that's not normal for digital projects. It's like, well, I'll make a thing which could take anywhere from like a couple hours to several weeks. I don't know. Like,
totally.
You don't know which yaks you're gonna have to shave till you get out the razor. And
for sure. Oh my God. Yeah. Tell me about it.
So in these cases you have mentioned, these like handful of gold standard cases where libraries can do really effective digital humanities work. What does that look like?
I think it looks different in different places. I don't know that there's a recipe for it that would fit every institution. But I think what I've noticed is that like one kind of unifying characteristic of some of these places is that there's sort of a cohort of librarians or people who work in libraries who can support each other and establish some camaraderie and even like a constituency, like a voting bloc within library politics. The other thing that I've noticed is that people seem to benefit from being given a pretty high degree of autonomy. So like trusting good people seems to be one unifying element of places that have established successful library DH collaborations. Some places have strong senior advocates, and that is really helpful. I think when there's when there's someone in a position of power who can kind of shield more junior scholars from any kind of political blowback, it seems to result in a lot of activity and productivity. Yeah, and I think that, you know, just as in any happy workplace, people need to be permitted to make mistakes and try things. I think, you know, in the current climate for libraries, there's a lot of pressure on library administrators, I guess, to capture metrics and kind of report things in ways that make their funding decisions legible to university administrators. And I do understand like why that happens. But the fact is that there's not always going to be a business case for a digital humanities project. Like there's a little bit of confusion there about like, you know, rolling out a new OPAC, which is one kind of digital project, and like doing a digital humanities project, which is a completely different beast altogether, and won't have a business case. And so I think people get confused about that.
I find it interesting, although sadly not surprising, that when I ask, you know, what does library digital humanities look like, the answer that you gave is 0% technical and 100% political.
Oh, that's true. Well, that may just be like, you know, a symptom of my own neurosis rather than what's actually happening on the ground. But, you know, I think like some people, you know, yeah, it's really hard. I think that's another thing is like, it's really hard to find the people with the right technical skills combined with the right humanities background, combined with the right political skills to kind of pull something off like that within a library.
Which presumably is at least part of why it tends to rely on successful cohorts. It's easier to find those skills spread out across several people than
That's right. That's right. It's so important just to have someone who you feel like has your back, and can help you get something done if you can't do it by yourself.
Well, I think I do want to ask a little bit about technical things and then maybe wrap up, because I know that people always ask me like what specific tools or languages or whatever should I learn, which is not necessarily the right question, because often the right question does happen on like a higher abstraction level. But if there are librarians who want to build up those digital humanities technical skills, are there particular directions that are you think most likely to be fruitful? Like recognizing that digital humanities means 500 different things, and the particular pathway you take may be very different with different skills. But are there particular like obvious entry points you would suggest?
Okay, yes. So like you, like my first impulse is to be like, well, you know, like there are many different technologies, whatever. But I know that's not what those people want to hear. They want to hear like, what is the thing I should learn, which is a totally reasonable thing to want. So I'm just gonna tell them, and then you can argue with me.
Awesome.
Or someone else can argue with me if you disagree. So, okay, here we go. I'm gonna say, like, if you're interested in textual editing and textual additions, you should learn TEI and XSLT. If you are interested in working with data, i.e. like gathering data from the web and, you know, manipulating it, then you should learn either R or Python or both. If you're interested in data visualization, either R or D3. If you want to do fancy web design, you know, HTML, CSS, and then maybe JavaScript or PHP. That's what I'm going to say. What do you think?
I think that is gratifyingly, I'm writing notes so I can write them in the show notes, but I think that is gratifyingly specific. And it makes a lot of sense, honestly. I mean, these are, yeah. I would probably say Python too, because I'm partial to that. And my friend Tara Andrews, who does textual editing, is always going on about TEI and XSLT and so forth. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it underscores what we were saying before about how useful it is to have a group, because you can totally imagine the person doing the textual work who has this one set of skills, and the person making the web thing to make it pretty and public having this totally different set of skills.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's just like, I guess most of us at a certain point have a tiny bit of skill in a few different areas. But yeah, it really does take some specialized skill if you want something that looks and feels like the level that we're used to encountering from well-funded places.
Yeah. That was one of the things that took me far too long to learn, just hanging out in the Code for Lib IRC chat room, is people talking about all these different technologies, and like, wait, it's not that all of them know all of those things and all the things I know.
Totally.
So I know my things, and they know their things, and some other people know some other things, and like collectively there are all of these things that we know, but no one of us actually knows more than a fairly small fraction of them.
Yeah, like
that's
nobody's
okay.
like super pro at everything. I know I had that same realization, and I was like, maybe I don't need to like be a Unix administrator. Like that's okay. I'm gonna let someone else like do that. And that's why when people say like, what do you do when students come into your class with different technical abilities? I'm just like, it's not as big a deal as you think it is, as people always think it is, because of course people are going to come in knowing different things, but no one is going to know everything. Like literally, there's no reason someone would necessarily be an expert in both like the intricacies of network analysis and web design. There's no reason they would know both. So,
and if you're training people for an essentially interdisciplinary field, then you can have them work together, and that's one of the skills they need to have anyway.
I think it's really healthy and good to learn to be patient when someone else is learning something, and to learn that it doesn't mean you're dumb when you don't know something. I think that's a really valuable thing to know how to do.
Yeah, it's one of the things that always strikes me teaching intro programmers is just the emotional skill of not feeling dumb for not knowing it is one of the key things that you do learn at the early stages of technical learning.
And I'm still learning that. I was trying to do something with D3 this weekend, and I just cannot get the labels to show up, and I'm just like, well, I guess I wasn't meant to do this.
And you know that's not actually the truth, right? It's like, I guess I haven't found the correct semicolon yet is the actual thing that's going on. But
no,
but it's really hard to silence that voice.
Cut out for this. And it's hard to know who to ask for help too, without admitting defeat, or to ask for help from your colleagues can be really hard when you want to be respected. And so I feel like I have a lot in common with my students when they're learning to do things.
I still have so much stereotype thread about asking for help. Like, I have to force myself, and I'm a lot more likely to ask for help in like women only chat rooms than in the like Code for Lib or something where I love the people. But even so, it's like, I still feel stereotype threat asking for help, and I still feel like I can answer questions, but I shouldn't ask them. And I know it's dumb to feel that way, but I still do.
I know. Right? No, I'm the same way. Yeah. I hate it. Yeah. I hate having to ask for help, but for all the Googling in the world, there are some things where you just need a human being to be like, oh, you meant this, like, oh, you meant a VLOOKUP, because
how would you know so much faster?
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes you can't even figure out the terms to Google unless you're talking to a person. You're like, well, I need to do the thing, but it thing with that, and you just like point incoherently, and then they're like, oh, here's the technical term, where you can stick it into Google and like your question will be answered in a second. But
for sure,
you don't know the term. Yes.
Yeah, and like honestly, like for women, maybe in particular, like I understand why Stack Overflow has a lot of emphasis on like not duplicating questions and going back and looking and being a very polite kind of inquirer when it comes to questioning, but that kind of groundskeeping and gatekeeping and disciplinary function that a lot of the commenters perform on sites like that can have a real silencing effect, I think, for a lot of people. Like, I don't want to ask the wrong question and get in trouble and be denied points or something.
Yeah,
so it's hard to know where to go.
And there's a real art to answering those tactfully,
Mm-hmm.
See this answer that has already been answered, as opposed to like, shut up and you should have read the rules already or whatever.
Exactly, which maybe everybody should. I mean, everybody should, but
it would be helpful. But
if you don't know what to Google,
there's more and less tactful ways to express that, like, these are the community norms, and this is where you can maybe already find the answer.
Exactly. Yeah. We were talking this week about on the Programming Historian about how to increase women's participation in that.
I saw that thread.
It was interesting, and I guess my initial thought was like, it's not that women don't want to help, it's like they're already helping in so many other ways. All of us are overcommitted and overtaxed and exhausted and volunteering for so many things. And I know it's probably the case. Because I was tempted to say, well, like, those of us with some emotional intelligence should, help out on places like Stack Overflow. And then I was like, I can't do another thing, like I can't volunteer in another forum.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the standard problems with trying to increase diversity of participation, right? Is like, all of the underrepresented people with excellent skills are already incredibly overcommitted.
Yeah, everyone's exhausted.
It's a fact.
It's totally true. Yeah, it's totally true. But I mean, I think that's a reason to. I was thinking about this in the context of the Programming Historian. It's like, well, I think this is a reason not to kind of solicit more volunteer work from the people whom you want to be involved, but to place them in positions of decision-making authority. And then, in a group like the Programming Historian, that's hard because nobody really has decision-making authority. It's a collective, but it might be something like asking them into the inner circle where decisions get made, rather than, asking them to volunteer more of their time to write an extra tutorial or something.
Well, there's also just this huge question of what your community respects, right? Because if you need to have documentation or people hanging out in the beginner chat room or whatever to have that on-ramp, but then the only thing you actually respect in your community is technical contributions, then asking people to do that work however necessary is even more problematic.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, for a while, Allison Hagel, the other woman on the Programming Historian, and I were kind of relegated to outreach section of the editorial team. And after a while I was like, you know what? Like, A, we don't just do outreach, and B, like, outreach is kind of a devalued field. And so thankfully, like, one of the other editors recognized this and bumped us up into the regular team. But nobody wants to be like just the outreach person, even though that's a perfectly, like, we all need more of that, actually.
Yeah. And increasing the cultural value placed on that is really hard and takes its own kind of work.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, there's so much work.
And on that note, with vast piles of unfinished and undervalued work, I should probably wrap this up so we can both get to whatever 2 o'clocks we may have. But thank you very much for being on the show and telling us all about digital humanities. And
it was really fun. And
really
fun to get to talk.
Yeah, I'm glad I got to actually meet you over the interwebs.
Me too.
All right. So, thank you very much.
My pleasure.